The room had a single hum of air, the mats creaking under weight. Everyone knew the story before it began. A 400-pound champion, known for brute strength, stepping onto the gym floor. And across from her, a man no one doubted, yet none expected to handle this. Within 10 seconds, the crowd, dozens of seasoned martial artists, realized something profound had shifted. There was no struggle, no spectacle, only quiet control, and the air itself seemed to acknowledge who held the measure of the space. The gym was small, square, its walls lined with mirrors that reflected more than bodies. They reflected reputation. Mats covered the floor, worn from decades of training. Each scuff a story, each tear a memory of persistence and discipline. The air carried a faint scent of sweat and liniment. Not unpleasant, just familiar to those who had spent their lives moving in it. A group of students sat quietly along the edges, knees pulled close, eyes fixed. They did not speak. Even breathing seemed measured, in respect for the routines that had shaped this space. A few older practitioners leaned against the wall, their arms crossed, watching, noting. None of them needed to announce their presence. The gym had a memory, and memory demanded attention. Bruce Lee entered with a calm that unsettled no one, yet set the tone immediately. He removed his shoes, his movements deliberate, controlled, almost ceremonial. The room seemed to shift around him, not in awe, not in fear, but in recognition. Observers whispered later that it was the certainty of his presence that filled the space, a weight heavier than any voice, heavier than any boast. On the far side, the wrestler arrived. Her reputation preceded her, carried in stories of tournaments and victories, the size of her frame, the strength that seemed to bend circumstances to her will. But even her entrance, though commanding, was tempered by the subtle scrutiny of those who had watched Bruce Lee move before. The crowd sensed the tension, but it was unlike the tension of anticipation or fear. It was the quiet calibration of authority, the unspoken assessment of what was about to be tested. The air did not thrum with expectation. It rested, taut as a drawn bowstring. Every head turned, every eye followed, every heartbeat seemed slightly more pronounced. No one spoke. No one moved to intervene. This was understood as a space where actions, not words, would reveal truth. Even the mats, scuffed and frayed, seemed to absorb the watchful silence. In this environment, small details gained weight. A slight shift in stance, a pause before a breath, the way eyes tracked movement across the floor, all of it mattered. Witnesses later recounted how the room had felt impossibly large and impossibly small at the same time. Large, in the sense that the challenge seemed monumental. Small, in the sense that every subtle motion carried absolute clarity. And so the stage was set. A room full of observers, each acutely aware that the outcome had already begun to shape itself in the silent measures of presence, posture, and gaze. They did not yet know the method, but they understood the inevitability. Something was about to happen that would redefine their understanding of mastery, and it would begin not with struggle, but with stillness. The wrestler stood at the far edge of the mats, her frame imposing, her presence unmistakable. She was known for her sheer size, her ability to dominate any opponent through strength and momentum alone. In past encounters, her reputation had been enough to unsettle those who faced her. But here, in this gym, reputation alone was not the measure that mattered. Bruce Lee's approach was deliberate but understated. He did not rush, do not posture, did not attempt to diminish her physically. Instead, he allowed himself to be observed. His eyes scanned the space, taking in the positioning of the wrestler, the angles of the mats, the awareness of the onlookers. There was no expression of intimidation, nor challenge, only a calm assessment, an almost imperceptible measure of timing and distance. The room held its breath in subtle recognition. Those who had trained with Bruce Lee before recalled that his authority was never declared. It was assumed, absorbed by the environment. And now, in this moment, it filled the gym again. The wrestler shifted her weight, testing the invisible boundary between them. Muscles flexed, but her movements, while deliberate, were no longer absolute. Bruce Lee did not react immediately. Instead, he maintained a stillness that drew attention to itself. It was a presence that demanded consideration without effort, a quiet question posed. Do you understand what you are entering? The spectators noticed the shift first in the wrestler's eyes. Confidence wavered, almost imperceptibly. Her past victories, her dominance over the mats, met a stillness she could not anticipate. There was no challenge to respond to, no force to counter, only a calm that carried inevitability. Bruce Lee stepped lightly, adjusting a stance almost imperceptibly. Not a single motion was wasted. Every slight shift seemed premeditated, yet natural, as if the mats themselves guided him. The crowd, watching closely, felt an unspoken lesson. Mastery is not in movement alone, but in the precision of awareness, in the control of space, in the patience to wait until the moment itself reveals what must be done. The wrestler's presence, formidable though it was, began to bend to the room's new measure. Authority does not yield to size. It does not bend to threat. And in that quiet, the crowd understood that this was not about brute force. This was about recognition. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The audience later described the tension as distinct from fear or excitement. It was understanding. Everyone there felt this subtle shift. The measure of the room had begun to align. The moment had arrived without fanfare. No bell rang. No announcement punctuated the space. The crowd, conditioned by years of observing combat and skill, knew instinctively that the real contest was about to unfold. Not through words, but through presence and measured action. Bruce Lee shifted slightly, a subtle alignment of his stance. It was imperceptible to most outside the gym, but to those trained in movement, it communicated readiness, balance, and control. The wrestler mirrored nothing. Her weight remained dominant, her bulk imposing. Yet even as she exuded confidence, a subtle tension threaded through her posture, unnoticed by her, but unmistakable to the observers. The challenge was silent. Eyes, breath, and micro-movements became the language of the encounter. The gym seemed to contract, focusing on the space between the two figures. Every observer felt it. A question hung in the air, unspoken yet absolute. Who would measure the room? Who would dictate its rhythm? Bruce Lee's gaze did not linger on the wrestler's size. Instead, he scanned the environment, noting the way the mats absorbed weight, the way angles of approach could create space or close it, the unintentional openings in the body. The subtlety of observation, rather than anticipation of aggression, set the stage. The wrestler shifted slightly, as though testing a threshold. The crowd sensed her intent. Strength and mass were her tools, but strategy was absent. Here, in this gym, strategy was invisible, embedded in presence. And it unsettled her in ways brute force never had. Witnesses later described the tension as quiet but absolute. There was no performance, no attempt to dominate visually. It was an assessment, a mutual acknowledgement that the outcome was not determined by effort, but by control. Every slight motion by Bruce Lee, the turn of a shoulder, the positioning of a foot, communicated authority without confrontation. The audience leaned in collectively, though not physically. It was a suspension of expectation. There would be no theatrics, no drawn-out struggle. The room itself seemed to hold its breath as the invisible parameters of mastery crystallized. Time contracted. Moments were magnified. The wrestler's confidence, formidable in other arenas, began to bend to the silent structure of the encounter. The observers, trained to read the unspoken, felt the inevitability settle in. The demonstration, when it came, would not need force. It would need presence, precision, and timing. And in that stillness, the first lesson was already imparted. Dominance is not taken. It is acknowledged. The wrestler's bulk and prior victories mattered little against the quiet authority that had entered the room. By the time Bruce Lee adjusted his footing for the first small motion, the wrestler had already acknowledged, though perhaps unconsciously, that the balance of the room was no longer hers to dictate. The moment arrived almost imperceptibly. Bruce Lee shifted his weight, a subtle adjustment, and the room, already taut with anticipation, seemed to pause. The wrestler's eyes tracked him, searching for intent, for telltale signs of aggression, but there were none. Only measured presence, only controlled movement. Then, in less than 10 seconds, it happened. Not a flurry, not a struggle, not an attempt to overpower, but a series of minimal, precise motions that realigned the energy of the space. Each step, each subtle angle, each adjustment of posture carried intent, yet remained understated. Observers later described it as a slow-burn clarity, almost too quiet to notice at first, yet impossible to ignore once perceived. The wrestler's bulk, her strength, her previous dominance, all of it became secondary. It was as if the floor itself had shifted beneath her, yet she had not been pushed. She stumbled not outwardly, but internally, her confidence bending under the weight of precision she could not counter. The crowd, trained and untrained alike, sensed the shift immediately. Bruce Lee did not touch her with force. He did not strike, grapple, or throw. The method was invisible to anyone unversed in subtle movement. And yet, within those fleeting seconds, the atmosphere changed. The air no longer carried tension, it carried recognition. The room itself acknowledged the authority that had quietly established itself. Witnesses later recalled a dissonance between expectation and observation. They had prepared for spectacle, for a confrontation of size and strength. Instead, they witnessed the exact opposite, restraint and control so absolute that it rendered size irrelevant. Every micro-movement, every unspoken cue dictated the flow. It was an eloquence of mastery, not aggression. The wrestler's gaze faltered first. She had anticipated resistance, effort, a push or pull. She had not anticipated inevitability. Authority had arrived not through contest, but through the quiet calculus of presence and timing. 10 seconds had been enough, and then it ended. The room exhaled collectively, though no one had realized they were holding their breath. The encounter had lasted moments, yet its impact settled into the air like sediment, heavy and undeniable. In the silence that followed, no one questioned the outcome. There was no debate, no protest. Even the wrestler, once formidable and unshakable, had shifted her perception. The lesson was not in the display of force, but in its absence. The demonstration was complete, precise, and absolute. The wrestler's internal shift was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. She stood upright, but her posture had changed. The confidence that once radiated from her frame, heavy, commanding, had begun to fragment. Witnesses later described it as a quiet unraveling, not a dramatic fall, but a recalibration of presence. No words were spoken. No one needed to comment on what had occurred. The room absorbed the change, noting it in small, almost invisible ways, a hesitation in stance, a pause in breath, the way hands no longer flexed instinctively for leverage. The dominance she had carried into the gym had been challenged, and the challenge required no strike, no confrontation, only the absolute clarity of control. The spectators, trained in the nuances of movement and authority, recognized the moment immediately. They did not cheer. They did not gasp. They simply observed the shift in energy. Authority had not been taken by force. It had been acknowledged, reluctantly, but unmistakably. Even among the students, a lesson unfolded silently. Confidence built on size and repetition of victories could bend when confronted with presence and awareness. Mastery, they realized, was not about effort exerted. It was about space measured, reading intention, and influencing outcomes without spectacle. The wrestler's movements grew more deliberate, almost cautious. Each step, each adjustment of her balance, betrayed an awareness of her own uncertainty. Bruce Lee, meanwhile, maintained the same calm, measured stance. There was no triumph in his posture, no spectacle of victory. The power of the moment lay entirely in the recognition of authority. Witnesses later recounted that the collapse was psychological rather than physical. No one was injured. No one struggled. The lesson was absorbed in silence, as absolute as it was subtle. The wrestler, formidable in every sense outside that room, had confronted a force she could not measure by strength alone. The room remained quiet, the mats carrying the weight of the encounter. Students and practitioners later reflected on how the silence itself had carried more authority than any confrontation could. By the end of this chapter, the lesson was clear. Mastery is acknowledged, not forced. Confidence built on force may falter when confronted with precise, deliberate presence. The psychological shift, though invisible to an untrained eye, had lasting clarity, and it set the stage for reflection, discussion, and legend. Years later, those present still spoke of the incident in hushed tones. Not because it had been dramatic, not because it had been violent, but because it had rewritten their understanding of mastery. The gym, once merely a training hall, had become a repository of memory, a place where authority and presence were quietly measured, silently acknowledged, and deeply felt. The wrestler, despite her formidable record elsewhere, never described the encounter in terms of defeat. Instead, she recalled the shift in awareness, the subtle clarity of control she had witnessed. She noted how a single presence, precise and unassuming, could reshape the environment without confrontation. The story lingered in her reflections as much as in the recollections of the spectators. Students who had been on the edges of the mats carried the lesson into every subsequent session. They did not attempt to replicate the movement or the encounter. They could not, but they absorbed its principles: patience, observation, timing, restraint. Mastery was not about the most forceful strike or the largest body. It was about measuring space, reading intention, and influencing outcomes without spectacle. Bruce Lee, as always, departed the gym quietly. There was no proclamation of victory, no recognition demanded, no validation sought. The mats, the air, the silent witnesses, these were sufficient. The authority he carried did not rely on repetition or demonstration. It relied on the clarity of presence, understood and remembered by those who had seen it. Over time, the story became legend. Not in books, not in headlines, but in memory. Those who recounted it did so with precision and reverence, aware that the true lesson lay in the silence, the subtlety, the moments that had passed unnoticed yet carried infinite weight. The gym itself became a kind of shrine to that understanding, a space where mastery was defined not by victory or defeat, but by recognition, control, and restraint. And so, long after the mats had been cleared and the crowd had dispersed, the lesson endured. It lived in those who had witnessed it, quietly shaping approach, perspective, and thought. The encounter was not a story of domination, nor of physical conquest. It was a study of presence, a demonstration of efficiency, a teaching of restraint. And in its quiet, it endured, a benchmark for understanding authority and mastery that would outlast all who had been present, quietly whispering that sometimes the loudest lesson is delivered in silence.